Hi, this is Richard Claus, Student Engagement Staff at Glendale Community College. We're continuing to work through our readings for Philosophy 101. We're looking at the issue of the social contract. Last time we looked at Thomas Hobbes, and we saw his notion of the social contract and this issue of the state of nature. We're going to look now at a subsequent thinker, John Locke, who we're probably more familiar with, and he's obviously influenced us as Americans and our American Constitution in a profound way. We're going to see some of the same concepts pop up in Locke, but we're going to see how he has some different ideas about how they function. And so we're going to watch for some of the similarities and the differences between Locke and Hobbes. So if you've got your textbook again, hopefully you've done your reading. And this time is just, sort of helping you understand some of the key pieces. Sometimes the writing in the 18th century writers can be a little difficult. Their sentence structures is longer than we're used to. Some of the languages that we're not used to speaking that way. So hopefully what I can do is to just be a guide through the reading itself. And so that's what my goal is here. So if you've got your pen out, maybe you take some notes in the margins or whatnot. I'm on page 574 of the 4th edition. If you have the 5th edition, I know it starts on page 549. You can see there's social contract, and you see the name of John Locke. You see the dates listed there for him. And right away we begin to notice our author tells us that for the state of nature, Locke's views were a little differently. His view of humanity was a little more positive than Hobbes's was. We saw Hobbes's, in this state, people are nasty, brutish, and short. It's not a good place to be. All we do is fear death. John Locke is going to have the same notion of a state of nature, but the way he views it is going to be a little more positive in nature. Matter of fact, our author Chaffee is going to call it idyllic or almost ideal, or this beautiful place at times. And so that's intriguing to be aware of. And we're going to also notice with Locke, Chaffee points out on page 575, for Locke, however, the state is the servant of the people. And if the state fails to live up to the terms of the agreement, it can be dismissed through a revolution. That's going to be a huge point of difference, and also a huge point that begins to influence the founding of our country, and for example the Declaration of Independence. So watch for those things as well in your readings, as well as some of the other things you're watching, some of the other videos as well. On 575 we have this big green section that is from John Locke's The Second Treatise of Civil Government. I think it's helpful to read some key pieces of this as it'll help set some things up. It says, to understand political power right and derive it from its original, we must consider what state all men are naturally in. So this is the state of nature he's going to be talking about. And that is a state of perfect freedom. Now that's intriguing the way he describes it. That's different than the way Hobbes describes it, right? With this nasty, brutish, or fear of death all the time. Here he says it's a perfect freedom to order their actions, and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, within the bounds of the law of nature, without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other man. You get to do whatever you want within the bounds. Now that's a crucial distinction. We're going to see fleshed out here even in more detail in Locke. For Locke, there are boundaries. There is this moral law in the state of nature. And for Hobbes, there wasn't. Remember, there was no justice, no injustice. Those are created notions. Only after you get a governmental system, then can you have create the notion of justice and the conception of justice. Going on in the second paragraph, a state also of equality, so it's freedom and equality, the state of nature for Locke, very positive, wherein all the power and jurisdiction is reciprocal, no one having more than any other. It's just like, hey, we're all sort of in this together, you've got as much power as I do, we're just sort of reciprocating. There being nothing more evident than that creatures of the same species and rank, we're all human beings by the way, promiscuously born to all the same advantages of nature and the uses of the same faculties, so again this equality of people, should also be equal one amongst another without subordination or subjection, unless the Lord and Master of them all should by any manifest declaration of his will set one above another and confer on him by an evident and clear appointment an undoubted right to dominion and sovereignty. What's that? Who's this Lord and Master? What we're going to see, Locke's going to begin talking about God in his conception of philosophy here in the state of nature. Matter of fact, let's keep going on in section 6 there you see on the green box. But though this be a state of liberty, yet it is not a state of license. It's not a state of free-for-all. That's what license means in this context. It's license, I get to do whatever I want. So he says, although it's a state of liberty, it's not license. That's sort of a nice alliteration, a poetic way of saying it. It's not a free-for-all. Though man in that state has uncontrollable liberty to dispose of his person or possessions, yet he has not liberty to destroy himself, nor have the right to commit suicide, or so much as any creature in his possession, but where some nobler use than it is bare preservation calls for. Here's a key phrase I underline. The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Why? Why, Locke? Why would you say something like that? For men, he goes on, for men being all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise maker. He brings, that's God, into the equation. All the servants of one sovereign master sent into the world by his order and about his business, they are his property, whose workmanship they are, made to last during his, not one another's pleasure, and being furnished with like faculties, sharing all in one community of nature, there cannot be supposed any such subordination among us that may authorize us to destroy one another if we were made for one another, as if we were made for one another's uses. I'm going to stop there because the sentence goes on. They love to write these long, continuous sentences. But God, in his moral law, that we can access through reason, Locke is saying here, sort of sets the boundaries. Now, this is different, obviously, than we saw for Hobbes. He's going to mention now even justice in the end of this paragraph, the word justice, where Hobbes says there is no justice in the state of nature. And so this is all very much different than Hobbes. And again, I think this shows, and this is what you want to watch for in philosophers, it's not even whether a philosopher believes in God or has God someplace in their system, because Hobbes, I believe by all accounts, was some sort of deist, had some sort of notion of God in his system. But what role does it play in their philosophy? We might think about this, if you think about it in terms of philosophical categories. What are what metaphysical aspects, namely what exists, namely in this case God, how does it function in the system? Not is it just a belief sort of popped in there on the side, but for Locke it actually performs a function. It actually informs his ethics. So the metaphysics that there is a God, this invisible, omnipotent being that's infinitely wise maker that we owe an allegiance to, therefore grounds somehow morality in the state of nature, according to Locke. Watch for how people's philosophies, the different parts of it, move and fit together. Although Hobbes had a belief in God, it didn't seem to function in any actual real way in the way he understood the state of nature. No justice, no injustice in the state of nature, where for Locke, something completely different. All right, let's keep going on. On page 576, the next page, the green box says Chapter 9 in Roman numerals there, of the ends of political society and government. The question comes up, well, if this state of nature is so free, it's so great, Locke, why would we need a government? Why not just keep doing it? If there's this sort of law of God that we can access by reason, we're not hurting each other, we're sort of working together, why have a state, why have a government at all? And he's going to begin to answer that question here. If man in the state of nature be so free, as has been said, if he be absolute lord of his own person and possessions, equal to the greatest and subject to no body, what we just mentioned, why will he part with his freedom? Why will he give up this empire and subject himself to the dominion and control of any other power? Why would you do that? To which it is obvious to answer, he thinks it's very obvious, that though in the state of nature he has such a right, yet the enjoyment of it is very uncertain and constantly exposed to the invasion of others. He recognizes that not everybody is going to live up to that moral law. And so we're always going to be uncertain. So even though he doesn't recognize that everybody's nasty, shortish, and brutish and short in life, he's going to say, yeah, it's great, we have freedom, we have liberty, but I still have to look over my shoulder because I'm not sure everybody's going to respect my liberty. And so he, at the very end of that paragraph, he says, and it is not without reason that he seeks out and is willing to join in society with others who are already united or have a mind to unite for, what's he looking for? For the mutual preservation of their life, their liberties, life, liberty, and estates, which I call by the general name property. Life, liberty, and property. Remember that phraseology. You see section 124, he says, the great and chief end, that's the great purpose, therefore, of man's uniting into commonwealths or states and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property, to which in the state of nature there are many things wanting or lacking. So I want to guard property, which becomes a very high value for Locke. the state of nature lacks some things that will actually help protect it. He lists in 4 lacks that there are, which sometimes we don't have, that people that we can't decide their excuse me. He says the first one, an established, settled, known law received and allowed by common consent to be the standard. Because even though this is there's a natural law out there, we probably still need the governmental system to sort of codify that law so that everybody knows, hey, that's the law says this. Secondly, there is a want or a lack of a known and indifferent judge. If everybody gets to have a law but then says, but I get to determine how to use it, people won't always use it rightly. We sort of we want to have sort of an independent judge that can take the law and now use it as a wise or impartial judge. We have impartiality that's lacking in the state of nature. He says, thirdly, there often wants or lacks power to back and support the sentence when right and to give it due execution. So let's say you have a law, you now have a judge, he renders a decision, hey, person A, you're wrong, you need to pay person B $500. Person A says, I'm bigger than you, judge, I don't want to pay it. So we need a government behind them. You sort of need a police force. See, that's lacking in the state of nature. And then fourthly, he says, thus mankind, notwithstanding all the privileges of the state of nature, being but in an ill condition while they remain in it, are quickly driven into society. And so, because of all these wants, all these lacks, because of the 3 he mentioned there, they want to move themselves very quickly to have a government system. Even though state of nature was much more idyllic, much more ideal than Hobbes's, he says still it is better to relinquish some of our rights so we can have actually a better system, a better society with a law, a lawgiver, and enforcer of that law. We begin to see the branches of government begin to pop out here, and our author Chaffee brings that out. Although on page 578 he does bring out the judiciary, the judicial branch, what we call our courts, as a distinct branch, was not necessarily found in Locke. That actually is another gentleman named Baron de Montesquieu, and so just be aware of that. And at the center of Locke's thinking is the notion of property. On 578, he has a lengthy section, at least our author does, for us about the nature of property. I would encourage you to read that. And when you think about this philosophical question, how do you establish ownership of something? And so Locke takes up that question. He gives an answer here about how we might do that. He uses an issue of like gathering acorns. How do I know that these acorns that I picked off the ground? Because the state of nature, there's acorns everywhere. How do I know that how do I know which ones are mine? They don't come with my name on it. And he says, we'll read section 28 there in the center of this piece on 578. He that is nourished by the acorns he picked up under an oak, or the apples he gathered from the trees in the wood, has certainly appropriated them to himself. Nobody can deny but the nourishment is his. I asked him, when did they begin to be his? At what point were they his? After he ate them? When he digested, or when he ate, or when he boiled them, or when he brought them home, or when he picked them up? And it is plain, for these philosophers, everything's plain or evident. And it is plain, if the first gathering made them not his, nothing else could. If I don't acknowledge it when I first picked them off the ground, these are mine. He says, if you're not going to say that's the point at which they're his, then really there's no other point you could say it either. He says that the labor put a distinction between them in common. What was the labor? How did they get from off the ground into my hand? Well, labor. I bent over, I picked them up. That labor is something I added to the equation. That labor put a distinction between them and the common, between those in my hand and the common, that added something to them more than nature, the common mother of all, had done, and so they became his private right. The very last sentence of that paragraph, the labor that was mine, removing them out of that common state they were in, has fixed my property in them, because I gave labor. So you have to ask yourself, is that enough? Is that a sufficient condition? That's a whole philosophical issue about the nature of property itself, to ask yourself. He mentions also on page 579, continuing in that same reading, about what happens when people are doing this all around us. He mentions that, well, actually section 51 at the bottom of 578, I'm sorry. And thus I think it is very easy to conceive, again, easy to conceive, without any difficulty, how labor could at first begin a title of property in the common things of nature, and how the spending it upon our uses bounded it, so that there could be no reason of quarreling about title, nor any doubt about the largeness of possession it gave. Right and conveniency went together, for as a man had a right to all he could employ his labor upon, So he had no temptation to labor for more than he could make use of. Now that, I highlighted that. So he uses this labor, he gets this property, and he's going to have no temptation to labor for more than he could make use of. And you just ask yourself, in your common experience, is that true? Do people work for more than they can actually use? He adds, this left no room for controversy about the title, nor for encroachment on the right of others. What portion of man carved to himself was easily seen. Everybody could see, hey, those are his acorns. And it was useless as well as dishonest to carve himself too much or to take more than he needed. I wrote in my margins of my book, is this too optimistic a view of human nature? We saw Hobbes had a very pessimistic view. Is this a little too optimistic? Hey, if we're all just gathering what we need, no one's going to gather more than they need, and no one's going to want to encroach upon what I have. That's not going to happen. It seems a little too optimistic in the nature of that. Coming to 579, the bottom of that page of chapter, what he calls chapter 19 of the Dissolution of Government. This becomes a key passage that's relevant for the founding of our country, and Thomas Jefferson is going to pick up these kinds of thoughts. He says this, the reason why men enter into society is the preservation of their property, and the end why they choose and authorize a legislative, basically a state or government, is that there may be laws made and rules set as guards and fences to the properties of all members of the society, to limit the power and moderate the dominion of every part and member of the society. So we need those as guards. That language of guards is intriguing. He goes on and says, whenever the legislators endeavor to take away and destroy the property of the people. So what happens if those in charge now, they try to take away the property? Instead of guarding, as guards do, they now say, let's go take the property of the people. Locke says they have a right then to rebel. Or to reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power. They put themselves into a state of war with the people. At this point, the government is now warring with the people, who are thereupon absolved of any further obedience. So the people now, I don't need to obey you anymore because now you are making war against us by trying to take our property or put us under this arbitrary power. And so they are left the common refuge with which God has provided, again, there's God, against force and violence. Whensoever, therefore, the legislative, that's the government, shall transgress this fundamental rule of society, and either by ambition, fear, folly, or corruption, endeavor to grasp themselves or put into the hands of any other absolute power over the lives, liberties, life, liberty, and estates of the people, property, by this breach of trust, they forfeit the power the people had put in the hands for quite contrary ends. And it devolves to the people, or falls to them, who have the right to resume their original liberty. They have this right to liberty. And what our author asks you to do, and I would encourage you to do this, if you've read that passage, and we read most of it right now, immediately read the beginning of the Declaration of Independence, which was mainly penned by Thomas Jefferson in 1776. Watch for the language. Watch for the language of guards. They put up. If you saw the movie National Treasure, there's a piece that's quoted out of this in that movie. It's a famous piece. This is obviously a famous piece of our history. Heavily influenced by Locke, and not by Hobbes. At least only indirectly, at least the state of nature, social contract, but not this notion of the sovereign that has complete control. We would have a different governmental system had we been influenced by Hobbes rather than Locke. And so the freedoms we enjoy today are a result of some of the philosophy. I'll mention two other quick things here. There's the last two more pages on 581 and 582. Our author mentions Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He had an even more positive view of humans, that they are naturally compassionate. And you can see he has a quotation there into 581. It is this compassion that hurries us without reflection to the relief of those who are in distress. We're so compassionate, we just see people, we want to help them. It is this which in a state of nature supplies the place of laws, morals, and virtues, with the advantage that none are tempted to disobey its gentle voice. Again, is that too optimistic? There's no sense of God here that is functioning as the rule. He's saying, no, just our inborn sense of compassion is we want to help people, and this is the moral law, this sense of compassion, and none are tempted to disobey its gentle voice. It is this which will always prevent a sturdy savage from robbing a weak child or a feeble old man of his sustenance they may have with pain and difficulty acquired if he sees a possibility of providing for himself by other means. So if there's a huge brute of a guy and he sees a child that has candy, he will never take the candy from the child as long as he thinks to himself, I could go out and actually work, make some money, and buy my own candy. For Rousseau, it's like, oh no, the compassion of this person will never allow him to do that. He'll never steal from a child or an old man. He'll never take what he can get away with because he knows, hey, I could go work for it. Again, is that too optimistic a view? It's intriguing that Rousseau's vision of politics that is not developed here actually can lend itself to totalitarianism. At least some interpreters of Rousseau have said that. Bertrand Russell was a famous philosopher. He thought that about Rousseau's philosophy. Bertrand Russell was writing his History of Western Philosophy in 1943, and he writes this about Rousseau. Rousseau is the inventor of the political philosophy of pseudo-democratic dictatorships as opposed to traditional absolute monarchies. He didn't want a monarchy, so he used the language of democracy, but again, you find this, what he calls this general will that comes into being in sort of the society, and it's always right. Even if your own personal opinion goes against it, you're wrong. And you know you're wrong because it's going against the general will. And so because of this and this tendency to sort of slide into totalitarianism, Russell said this. He's writing in 1943 when these names of these people I'm going to mention are very much alive, and they're very live options. He says, at the present time, 1943, Hitler is an outcome of Rousseau, Roosevelt, and Churchill of Locke. He's recognizing that the philosophical systems of Rousseau versus Locke have morphed themselves and manifested themselves in historical realities. The one, he says, Rousseau's philosophy manifests itself actually in Hitler's Germany, and Locke's philosophy manifests itself in the United States context and the English context with FDR and Churchill. That's at least Bertrand Russell's understanding of Rousseau. I'll mention one other thinker on here on page 582, David Hume, who basically says this whole state of nature, social contract stuff is just bunk. It's just crazy. You can see the second paragraph. But would these reasoners, these philosophers, look abroad into the world, they would meet with nothing that in the least corresponds to their ideas. Hey, go take a look out there. That's not how life functions. People don't all of a sudden recognize, hey, we've got all this freedom. Let's come together, make a government, and we'll be happier all. That's not what happens at all. And so he goes on. It's a famous quotation as well. I encourage you to read that. One other piece, I'll just mention this. It's on the last section of 582, second to last paragraph. That John Locke anticipates some of David Hume's criticism. He recognizes the distinction between what he calls prior consent. He says most people have not had the opportunity to give prior consent. If you go back to the state of nature, I wasn't there, you weren't there at the state of nature. We did not get to decide, okay, I'll give up exactly this much freedom, whatever we're going to call it, and you give up that much, and we weren't part of that process. We didn't get to deliberate, we didn't get a choice, nobody asked us to raise our hand and vote on this. We found ourselves in a culture already. We found ourselves in a governmental system. And so I didn't give prior consent. How can I be held accountable to it? Well, John Locke says something. He says you give tacit consent. So prior versus tacit consent. That's the key phrase here. By choosing to live in a society and accept the social political structure that it provides. In other words, by choosing to live in a society, I use its services, accept its protections, you are confirming your voluntary consent to the state. So yeah, I didn't vote on it in terms of prior consent, but I give tacit consent. Every time I like it when the police come and protect my house from the robber. Every time they come and protect my house from a fire. Every time I like it when the government provides, clean water. I don't have to go out and dig a well on my own. I just turn on a tap. I like all these things. I use all these things. I'm giving tacit consent, saying, yeah, I'm basically consenting to live in this system because I'm getting all these things from me. I'm partaking of all the fruit of it. Therefore, I consent to it. So that's the general notion of tacit consent that Locke develops. So again, same constructs, a lot of the same words, state of nature, social construct, and yet we see how there's different movements of it, different conceptions or understanding of it that flow, and those actually then affect how we have and structure societies today. As we saw Bertrand Russell, You take Rousseau's notion, he's going to say it produces some totalitarianism. You take Locke's notion, it produces something that is not totalitarian in nature. Again, things to wrestle with, be aware of. So again, thanks for listening. Hope that helped. Hope that helped, and so we'll pick this up again next time. Thanks.